At its peak, the Persian Empire stretched from Greece to northwestern India, governing over 50 million people across 3 continents. Founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC, Persia became the largest empire the ancient world had seen, a civilization built on trade routes, royal roads, and a model of governance that shaped empires for centuries. Before Persia became an empire, it was a collection of tribal peoples living in the high plateaus of what is now modern-day Iran. The Persians belonged to a larger group of Indo-Iranian peoples who had migrated into the region centuries earlier, settling in an area they called Pars, a land of mountains, dry plains, and harsh winters that demanded discipline and adaptability from everyone who lived there. The geography itself shaped the Persian character. Communities learned to manage scarce water through underground irrigation channels called Qanats, to move livestock across seasonal pastures, and to trade with neighboring peoples across difficult terrain. Survival in that landscape required cooperation and organization long before any king united them under a single banner. For generations, the Persians existed under the shadow of more powerful neighbors. The Medes, a related Iranian people to the north, dominated the region and treated the Persians as a subordinate population. This arrangement held for decades until a single leader changed everything. In 559 BC, Cyrus II came to power as king of the small Persian kingdom of Anshan. He inherited a modest territory and a people accustomed to operating within someone else's political framework. What he did with that inheritance transformed the ancient world. Within 2 decades, Cyrus had conquered the Medes, absorbed the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia, and captured Babylon, one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world, without a single major battle. Babylon surrendered. Its people, including thousands of Jewish exiles held captive there for generations, were freed by royal decree. Cyrus ordered that displaced peoples be allowed to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. This act alone spread his reputation across the known world, and the Hebrew Bible would later describe him as a chosen instrument of divine will, an extraordinary distinction for a foreign king. What made Cyrus different from every conqueror before him was not the size of his army. It was his governing philosophy. Where other rulers destroyed temples and enslaved populations, Cyrus preserved local religions, respected existing customs, and allowed conquered peoples to maintain their own leadership structures under Persian authority. He presented himself not as a foreign occupier, but as a legitimate continuation of each local tradition he encountered. In Babylon, he participated in the New Year festival and honored Marduk, the city's chief deity. In Egypt, later Persian kings would follow the same pattern, adopting the title of pharaoh and making offerings to Egyptian gods. This approach was not simply generosity. It was a calculated strategy that reduced resistance and built loyalty across an extraordinarily diverse empire. By the time Cyrus died in 530 BC, Persia controlled more territory than any empire in history up to that point. His son Cambyses II extended Persian rule into Egypt, completing the conquest of the ancient world's most iconic civilization. His successor Darius I pushed the borders further east into Central Asia and northwest into Thrace and Macedonia. The empire now connected the Mediterranean world to the edges of South Asia, governing dozens of different peoples, languages, and traditions under a single administration centered on one royal family and one increasingly formalized system of imperial governance. Running an empire that stretched across 3 continents required more than military force. Darius I, who ruled from 522 to 486 BC, understood this better than any Persian king before him. He reorganized the entire empire into administrative units called satrapies, regional provinces each governed by a satrap, an appointed official who collected taxes, maintained order, and reported directly to the king. There were 20 of these provinces at the empire's height, each large enough to be a kingdom on its own. To prevent any single satrap from accumulating too much independent power, Darius installed a separate military commander and a royal secretary in each province, with all 3 reporting independently to the central government. It was a system designed with distrust built into its architecture. And it worked. To hold these provinces together, Darius built infrastructure on a scale the ancient world had rarely seen. The royal road stretched nearly 2,700 kilometers from the city of Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa, one of the empire's 4 capital cities. Mounted messengers could travel its entire length in 7 days, a journey that would take an ordinary traveler 3 months on foot. Along the road, a network of stations provided fresh horses, food, and lodging at regular intervals, creating a communication system that kept the king informed and in control across enormous distances. Merchants, diplomats, and military units used the same road, transforming it into an artery of commerce and authority that bound the empire's distant edges to its center. Greek historian Herodotus described the Persian postal system with undisguised admiration, noting that neither snow nor rain nor heat stopped its couriers from completing their appointed routes. The capitals themselves reflected the empire's complexity. Persepolis, built by Darius and expanded by his son Xerxes, served as the ceremonial heart of Persian power. Its construction brought together workers, craftsmen, and materials from across the empire. Greek architects, Egyptian stonemasons, Babylonian metalworkers, and Lydian goldsmiths all contributed to a city designed to project permanence and authority. The great Apadana Palace featured columns over 20 meters tall and relief carvings depicting delegations from every corner of the empire arriving with tribute, a visual statement of the world's submission to Persian rule. The site took decades to complete and was never truly finished, each king adding new structures that expressed their own vision of imperial grandeur. Economically, the empire functioned through a standardized system introduced by Darius that regularized taxation and encouraged long-distance trade. The daric, a gold coin bearing the king's image, circulated across trade routes that connected the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Central Asia. Merchants moved grain, textiles, metals, and spices through Persian-administered roads and ports, generating wealth that funded both the imperial bureaucracy and continuous construction projects. The empire also maintained a sophisticated system of state-managed storage and redistribution. Grain collected as taxes in productive agricultural regions was stored in royal warehouses and redistributed to soldiers, laborers, and officials across the empire. This network of supply and logistics made it possible to project military power and maintain administrative control across distances that would have paralyzed less organized states. Behind the monuments and royal decrees, the Persian Empire was a place where millions of ordinary people lived out their daily lives in ways largely unchanged by imperial politics. Farmers in Mesopotamia worked the same irrigated fields their ancestors had cultivated for thousands of years. Merchants in Babylon haggled over grain prices in markets that had been operating long before any Persian king arrived. Weavers in Egypt produced linen under the same techniques passed down through generations. Potters, fishermen, scribes, and herders across the empire's vast territory woke each morning to routines defined far more by season and local custom than by anything decided in Persepolis. The empire's governing genius was that it rarely disrupted the rhythms of everyday life. It simply absorbed them, taxed them, and moved on. Workers who built Persepolis were paid in rations of grain, wine, and occasionally silver, a detail preserved in thousands of clay tablets recovered by archaeologists in the 20th century. These administrative records, written in Elamite, document a labor force drawn from across the empire and managed with bureaucratic precision. They show laborers receiving wages, taking days off for religious festivals, and submitting complaints to administrators who were apparently expected to respond. Women appear in these records as workers in their own right, sometimes receiving higher rations than men for equivalent tasks, and female supervisors managed teams of other workers. The image of the Persian Empire as purely a machinery of conquest dissolves when set against these practical, human documents. The empire ran on paperwork as much as it ran on armies. Yet tension ran beneath the surface of this ordered world. The satrapy system, designed to project loyalty, produced its own instabilities over time. Regional governors accumulated personal wealth, maintained private armies, and occasionally pursued independent ambitions that had little to do with Persian imperial interests. Several satrapies rebelled during the long reign of Artaxerxes II, and the king spent decades managing these internal challenges rather than expanding Persian territory. The further a province sat from the imperial capitals, the harder it became to enforce compliance and the easier it became for a determined governor to operate as a de facto independent ruler. The wars with Greece added a different kind of strain that reverberated through Persian society. The defeats at Marathon in 490 BC and Salamis in 480 BC did not destroy Persian power, but they established a persistent western frontier that consumed resources, manpower, and political attention for generations. Xerxes had committed enormous wealth and an army drawn from dozens of subject peoples to his Greek campaign, and its failure damaged royal prestige in ways that were difficult to repair. The Persian military was vast, but it relied heavily on conscripted soldiers from across the empire, men whose commitment to Persian strategic goals was practical rather than personal. Greek mercenaries were increasingly hired to fill gaps, creating a dependency on foreign soldiers that reflected a deeper erosion in the empire's ability to mobilize its own population effectively. Managing that reality required constant negotiation, payment, and political calculation at every level of imperial administration, from the throne room in Persepolis down to the garrison commanders stationed at the empire's outermost edges. The Persian Empire did not collapse suddenly. It eroded gradually through a combination of internal fragmentation, dynastic conflict, and a military force it ultimately could not match. By the 4th century BC, the empire that Cyrus had built through discipline and political intelligence was being held together by payments, compromises, and the sheer weight of its own institutional memory. The administrative structures Darius had designed with such precision were still functioning, but the political will that had once driven them was increasingly absent at the top. Kings who had once campaigned personally at the head of their armies were now managing court factions from behind palace walls, dependent on advisors and officials whose loyalty was transactional rather than earned. Succession crises became increasingly damaging with each passing generation. Persian kings in the later period frequently came to power through palace intrigue, assassination, and civil war, rather than through orderly inheritance. Artaxerxes III briefly restored central authority in the 340s BC by reconquering Egypt and suppressing rebellious satraps with considerable violence, but his reign ended when he was poisoned by a powerful court official. His successor lasted 2 years before meeting the same fate. The instability at the top weakened the administrative networks that held the empire's distant provinces in alignment, and it signaled to ambitious men throughout the empire that power in Persia was no longer protected by institutional strength, but by proximity to the right people in the right room. When Alexander of Macedon crossed into Persian territory in 334 BC, he faced an empire that was structurally intact but politically fractured. His victories at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela were militarily decisive, but they were made possible in part because Persian resistance was never fully unified behind a single coherent strategy. Darius III was a capable commander in difficult circumstances, but he led an empire whose provincial governors had grown accustomed to calculating their own interests independently. City after city opened its gates to Alexander, applying the same pragmatic logic Persian subjects had always used. Cooperation with power brought stability, and stability was worth more than loyalty to a dynasty that could no longer guarantee it. Persepolis was burned in 330 BC. Whether this was a deliberate symbolic act of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens in 480 BC, or a moment of excess following a victory celebration, remains debated among historians. What followed that fire, however, was not erasure. Alexander adopted Persian court customs, dressed in Persian royal clothing, and retained experienced Persian administrators in positions of real authority. He understood that governing what Persia had built required Persian methods. His successors, the Hellenistic kings who divided his empire after his death, built their own kingdoms using Persian administrative models as a foundation. The Parthian and Sasanian empires that rose across Iranian territory in the centuries that followed explicitly drew on Persian royal traditions, iconography, and governing principles to legitimize their own power and connect themselves to a prestigious past. The Persian Empire left behind something more durable than its monuments. It demonstrated that diverse populations speaking dozens of languages, practicing different religions, and organized according to different social systems, could be governed within a single political framework, not through forced uniformity, but through a calculated tolerance that made cooperation more attractive than resistance. That idea traveled far beyond the borders of ancient Iran. It shaped how Alexander governed, how Rome administered its provinces, and how later Islamic caliphates managed the extraordinary diversity of the territories they absorbed. The template Cyrus first sketched in the 6th century BC outlasted every army that ever marched against it.